Good evening. I would like to welcome all of you. We are talking about a very interesting topic, Jihad, which is very much known in the United States as a hot topic. But the topic that we are elaborating on is not very well known, and that is the spirit part of Jihad. What is the spiritual Jihad? So it's will be a good actually conversation. I am very pleased that we have very good scholars, and tonight we have a prominent scholar who will be talking about the struggle of the mother of Moses. Struggle. Jihad means struggle, actually. Literally, it means struggle. So spiritual jihad, spiritual struggle, struggle in general. Mother of Moses was, talking the truth against Pharaoh. And what is this? What's the meaning of this? So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Zeki Sarı Toprak. I am the director of the Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies here at Carroll University. It's a pleasure to have you all here today for the opening of the 2015 Nursi Chair Conference entitled Spiritual Jihad, A Path for the 21st Century. The Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies was established in 2003. The chair hosts conferences, speakers, and every spring we have a week of Islamic art and culture on JCU campus, generally towards the end of March. As the chair, one of my goals is to help promote interfaith dialogue, cooperation, and understanding. And I hope that this event tonight and tomorrow will help to further both of these goals. I would like to thank everyone for coming to this evening, and look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's panel sessions. We will have 4 panels beginning at 9:30. So if you do not already have it, feel free to take one of the cards at the back of the auditorium which lists tomorrow's events. And also I have to thank very much my assistant, Patrick, I know if he's around, who is really contributed greatly for the organization of this event. He is the one who is working behind the scene. So now I would like to ask Dr. Sheila McGinn, who is the chair of the Theology and Religious Studies Department here at Carroll University, to introduce tonight's special guest, Dr. Michael Sells. Dr. McGinn, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sarı Toprak. I'd like to add my welcome to his on behalf of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and on behalf of the university. Welcome to Carroll. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. We're delighted to have you. And I'm very pleased to have been asked to introduce our well-known speaker tonight. Professor Michael Sells serves as the John Henry Barrows Professor of Islamic History and Literature at the University of Chicago. He studies and teaches in the area of Quranic studies, Sufism, Arabic and Islamic love poetry, mystical literature from Greece, from Islamic, Christian, and Jewish perspectives, and also religion and violence. The new and expanded edition of his book, Approaching the Quran, The Early Revelations, appeared in 2007. He has published 3 volumes on Arabic poetry, Desert Tracing, 6 classical Arabian odes, which focuses upon the pre-Islamic period, Stations of Desire, which focuses upon the love poetry of Ibn al-Arabi, and the Cambridge History of Arabic Literature, Al-Andalus, which he co-edited and to which he contributed. His books on mysticism include early Islamic mysticism, translations and commentaries on the influential mystical passages from the Quran, Hadith, Arabic poetry, and early Sufi writings, and mystical languages of unsaying, an examination of apophatic language with special attention to Plotinus, John the Scot, Ibn al-Arabi, Meister Eckhart, and Marguerite Porret. So you can see that he crosses the boundaries in terms of interreligious dialogue in antiquity and into the Middle Ages, and obviously for us in the present tonight. His work on religion and violence includes The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia, The New Crusades, Constructing the Muslim Enemy, which he co-edited and to which he contributed, Armageddon in Christian, Sunni, and Shia Traditions in the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Violence, and Finnas of Medina, Islam, the Jews, and the Construction of Militancy in Fighting Words, Religion, Violence, and the Interpretation of Sacred Texts, which was edited by John Renard and published by the University of California Press in 2012. So that was the most recent publication. And I would invite you all to please welcome our renowned speaker, Professor Michael Sells.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor McGinn for her very thoughtful introduction, and I want to thank Dr. Zeki and everybody involved in the foundation for their generosity, for the years of extraordinary work they've done at John Carroll and with these annual events. This is my second time of having the privilege and delight of taking part in one of these events. Today, I would like to talk about a figure that I consider of extraordinary interest and importance in the Quran. The only woman figure in the Quran who is said in direct terms to have received wahi, a term that is often translated as revelation, as a direct communication from the divine, of the divine's will. And as the manner in which Musa received the wahi, the way that she received the wahi in a manner that really enabled the entire first part of the Musa story is bound up with the first part of the Musa story. I use the term Musa and Musa instead of Moses and the mother of Moses to emphasize two things. One is that there are many of our co-citizens and friends and neighbors who have the Arabic-based names, and two, that the stories in the Quran, while they have extraordinary resonance with many in the Bible, are not necessarily the same story. And I find if I'm discussing these figures in class, and I use the term Moses, then often some tend to read or assume that what the Quran is saying is exactly what the Bible said, even after having read the passage, because in American culture, that version or that particular framing of the narrative is so present. Musa and Musa were confronted with oppression, with a force, Pharaoh, and in the Quran it does not say the Pharaoh, it just says Pharaoh. And in many cases, it seems to me, especially in the passages I'll be talking about, that Firaun can be an individual ruler, but it also refers to the system of which Firaun was part. And Musa was told, as I'm sure you're all familiar, to go to Pharaoh, Ithab ila Firauna, for he has transgressed, innahu tagha. And quite rightly, that caused a certain fear and trepidation. And I will be tying the story of Musa, the wahi she received, the statement that she received from the divine saying, "Do not fear and do not sorrow," the same statements that Musa would receive later when he was confronting Firaun and Firaun's magic. And we'll try to tie those things back together and raise these questions. First, why was there such concern among many of the classical exegetes about explaining that Musa's wahi was not like the wahi of the male prophets, that it was of different kind? And I'll be giving these various examples. And that she could not be a prophet, neither a prophet in the sense of a Rasul, because the Quran states that to the prophet of the Quran, that we have sent men as Rasuls before, men in the gender-specific sense, but also that she could not be a Nebi. A Nebi, both Nebi, of course, and Rasul can be translated by the word prophet. Amina Wadud, in her thoughtful treatment of Musa, pointed out that, which I will be stressing in a different way, that the Quran is unambiguous in stating that wahi was given to Musa. I would add further that the Quran was extraordinarily emphatic in stating that Musa received wahi. And I'll be explaining why I think that. She points out that her point is that to be a Rasul meant to proclaim a message publicly and bring a whole set of new religious and societal order in a situation in which it would be very difficult for anyone to gain a hearing, and it would even be more difficult for a woman in patriarchal societies to gain a hearing. Ibn Hazm has a very, very irritated commentary on the exegetes who try to deny that Musa had received prophecy, nubuwah. And I'll be talking about why Ibn Hazm found that to be extraordinarily difficult to accept, that they would deny her having received nubuwah. But I would raise a similar issue, that the classical exegetes seem to have believed that a Nebi is one who raises the message given to him by God in a public forum, and that women, by their role in society before Islam, and even, according to exegetes, by Islamic law in certain ways after Islam are not to engage in that kind of activity. And there still would be a way of not diminishing the majestic and extraordinary nature of the wahi given to Musa, although that's not the way that Ibn Hazm cared to go. Let me begin then the discussion here by reading a bit of translation that I've done. I know we are all of diverse backgrounds, and so I've worked on it for some years on a translation of this particular passage. Of course, like anyone who translates any great literature, we know how difficult it is to make the translation even minimally faithful to the power and the tone and the nuance of the original. And it is particularly difficult in the case of the Quran for many reasons. And I might be talking about those as I go along. The story of the mother of Musa is told in two places in the Quran. In Surah 20, Surah Taha, and in Surah 28, Surah Al-Qasas. I'm going to read the first section of the Surah of Taha in translation. But before I do, I want to make a couple larger points about the story of Musa in the Quran, because Musa's extraordinary role and importance in that story, and the fact that that story is so important in the Quran, are related. I would also request that Professor McGinn or one of our other companions give me a signal after about 40 minutes so that we have some time for discussion. And I feel it's better for a speaker not to feel incomplete than to miss often the most interesting part of the event, which is the discussion. Please also, if my voice drifts off and anyone has trouble hearing, please just make this gesture and I will see it. The prophet Musa takes a principal role in the sacred history within the Quran. It occurs through the frequency of Musa's appearances in the Quran, the sustained nature of them, the multiple overlaps of particular episodes of his life and prophetic career in different parts of the Quran, each told with a distinctive perspective and in a distinctive style, and the intensity with which the life of Musa and the unfolding life of the prophet of the Quran reflect one another. And let me explain why I use the term the prophet of the Quran instead of the term Muhammad. There is no place in the Quran where the divine voice addresses the prophet of the Quran by name. There is the divine voice in the Quran is quoted as addressing Musa by name, Ya Musa, Ibrahim, the son of Mary, Isa, or Jesus, the son of Mary. There is never a case where the divine voice addresses the prophet of the Quran by name. The word Muhammad appears, but it is not in a direct address situation. Why does that matter? It matters, I think, fundamentally, because by always addressing the prophet figure simply as you, singular, masculine you, it sets up an intimacy between the divine voice and the prophet who is receiving the message and hearing the words. That intimacy, as if you didn't have to say the name, as if the hearer, the audience of the Quran, were being brought into a conversation, an intimate conversation. It also sets up an intimacy between the prophet and the audience of the Quran. It's as if instead of having the prophet transmitting a message that he was given long before or sometimes before, it's as if the hearer of the Quran, what I call the audience instead of the readers, those who hear along the Quran, are overhearing the message as it was given to the prophet, and then through the prophet to them. So they're hearing it to the prophet and through the prophet, through the quotations from the prophet. That intimacy allows for a third kind of special characteristic of the Quran, which is that the ancient prophets, like Musa, and other holy figures, including Musa, who received Wahi, then are the words that the divine spoke to them are being narrated to the prophet. But as they're being narrated to the prophet, it's as if the hearers are being brought back and we're overhearing them at the time of Musa. That resounding set of embedded speech acts, one speech within another, I think is a fundamental aspect of the way the Quran works. And I think as a translator, one tries to find ways of not having the translation do anything to get in the way of something that's essential, even if it means that the readers of the translation need to become accustomed to certain things. Another thing I think that's very important in this regard is the quality that's called iltifat, the turning, the constant turning. So instead of the Quran speaking in one way continually about the deity, it speaks in a variety of ways. God speaks as we, speaks of God's self in the third person, he, speaks of your Lord, my Lord, their Lord, Lord of all beings. These words, my Lord or your Lord, have different resonances, of course, than Allah, and they have different resonances than we. And by doing that, continually changing back and forth, and you'll hear it reflected in the translation, my sense is the Quran resists what I would call objectifying, delimiting God language. There is no simple, objectifiable God, quote, unquote, that one can simply refer to. The Quran is always challenging the audience of the Quran to follow its shifts as if it were saying, this is speaking to you. This is not speaking about something out there. This is something speaking to you, some person, some being speaking to you. So those are some thoughts on some of the things you'll hear in the translation. The last thing I would say in introducing this translation is that each time the Quran tells the story of early Musa, that is the time from Musa's birth and being thrown into the ark or the basket into the waters, to the time of his confrontation with Firaun, and finally his opening of the sea, escape through the sea with his people, and the drowning of Pharaoh. I call that the early Musa part of the Quran. It in many ways corresponds to the early period of the prophet's life, when the prophet was struggling in a similar way, was struggling speaking truth to power, was struggling without many supporters against a strong force, and had no army, had, by all rational standards, had little chance in succeeding. The second part, after Musa's and his people's crossing the sea, that corresponds much more to what is often referred to as the Medina period of the prophet's life. And this is that way in which the stories of the ancient prophets, especially the Musa story, which is the most detailed in all of the Quran, tend to mirror and be partially implicated in the prophet's own story. So that as the story of Musa is being told, in many ways it's also being the story of the prophet that's being told. I will read this section from Taha, and in Taha's version, it's a very sophisticated use of time and space. It doesn't start from the beginning and then go through to the next stage. It actually tells the early part of Musa's story to Musa as a reminder from the deity, saying, we did this when you were a child, we did this when you were growing up and you killed a man, and now here you are come to us now at the moment of the revelation, where the divine identity is revealed to him. And then the next part of the story is told in a prophetic future. That is, go to Pharaoh, say this, say that. And then it's not until almost halfway through the whole story in the surah when Firaun says, so who is this Lord of the two of you? That is Musa and Aaron, Harun, Ya Musa. It's not till Firaun says that the narrative has actually told us that Musa has actually gone to the court of Pharaoh as he was commanded to do. It's as if in a modern play or movie there was a fade out, and then there was a kind of gradually fading in. You hear a voice, who is this Lord of the two of you, Musa? And then you realize that's Musa in the court of Pharaoh, having followed the command to go to Firaun and explain about his Lord. So I will read then Surah Taha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Taha, we have not sent down the Quran that you be troubled. Only a reminder for one who knows awe. Sent down from the one who created the earth and high heavens, the compassionate has taken his place upon the throne. To him belong what is in the heavens and what is on the earth and what is between them and what is beneath the soil. If you pronounce openly, still he knows what is hidden and has concealed. Allah, no God, is but He. To Him belong the most beautiful names. In this section, we have not sent down the Quran to you. The default you in the Quran, unless it's someone specified else, is the Prophet of the Quran. So this is an introductory section, often in these surahs, that is an address directly to the Prophet. Then this statement, Hel ataka hadithu Musa. Has the story of Musa come down to you? How he saw a fire and told his people, stay, I sense a fire. Perhaps I'll find an ember or encounter guidance at that fire. Then as he drew near, he was called, Musa, I am your Lord. Remove your shoes. You are in the holy valley, Tua. I have chosen you, so listen to that being revealed. I am Allah, no God but I. Worship me and perform the prayer, remembering me. The hour is coming, I hide it nearly, that each may be rewarded with that to which he quickens. Do not let them turn you away from it, they who deny it, following their inclination, you to perish. What is in your right hand, Musa? My staff, I lean on it, batten the grass to feed my sheep, and find other uses for it. Cast it, Musa, he said. He cast it, and behold, a snake quickening. Seize it, he said, and do not fear. We shall turn it back to what it was before. Put your hand to your ribs, to emerge white but unharmed, another sign, so that we may show you some of our more glorious signs. Go to Pharaoh, he's transgressed. He said, this is clearly a reference to Musa, open my breast, Lord, and ease my task. Loosen the knot from my tongue, and assign me one of my family. Harun, my brother, stiffen through him my spine, and give him a share in my burden, that we may recite your praises often and remember you often. Of us you are the ever aware. Your request is granted, Musa, he said, as we graced you before another time. When we revealed throw him in the ark, then throw him in the deep to cast him to the shore, an enemy to me and him to take him. So have I cast over you my love, that you be fashioned under my eye. And your sister going forth saying, shall I show you to someone who will nurse him? Then we brought you back to your mother, that her parched eyes be cooled and she sorrow no more. And we tested you and tested you again, and you stayed with the people of Midian many years, and now here you are come, as determined. So have I formed you for myself, Musa. The way this sets up the frame of the story, it's as if we're still at the valley of Tua, where Musa received the vision of the fire and then heard the voice revealed the divine identity. There's been no statement that, in fact, Musa has gone anywhere. Musa has asked for Harun. It's not as if we're ever told that Harun shows up, but it's clear that he's been given his request. Then the text goes on, take my signs, you and your brother, and weaken not in remembering me. Go, both of you, to Pharaoh. He's transgressed. So this statement, go to Pharaoh, the first time in the singular, the second time with both of you, is framing this retrospective view of Musa's life. Embedded within it, at its heart, is the revelation to Musa. Is awhayna ilayha ma yuha. When we revealed to her what was being revealed, that being revealed. In Quranic rhetoric, this is a form of both repetition and the passive voice creates a certain kind of suspense. And it also creates a special kind of emphasis. And the only time that kind of phraseology is used with wahi is for the wahi given to the prophet of the Quran and the wahi given to Musa and the wahi given to Musa. Those are the three figures for which that kind of phrase is used. This was pointed out very carefully by several Quranic exegetes, including Zamakhshari, Fakhruddin Arazi, and Ibn Barajan. So having given a sense of that story, and I'll mention a bit about the other version of the story a little later, now I'd like to bring us into some of the stakes having to do with the issue of gender, the issue of power, and the issue of society. When the Quranic voice says to Musa, to Musa, don't fear, and that is brought out very much in the second version of the story, where the Quranic voice says, do not fear, la takhafi, and do not sorrow, wala tahzan. That order, not to fear and not to sorrow, is brought in. A similar statement is given right at the moment when Musa is about to confront Pharaoh and his court. And Pharaoh's men come out and cast their ropes and their staffs and make it appear to Musa's eye as if it were a serpent alive. And at that point, Musa is feeling a fear and anguish came into his self, into his heart. And at that moment, the divine narrator and the one who had given Musa the original command to go to Pharaoh enters the story as a hidden character and says, do not fear. And then when we're not actually told what happened in this version of the story, we're never told in this version of the story that Musa threw what was in his right hand, his staff. But the next thing we're told is that the magicians of the Pharaoh were thrown down prostrate in prayer, saying, we believe in the Lord of Harun and Musa. So the same interjection at the same moment of crisis to Musa at the moment of her fearing for having to throw her child into the deep waters, obviously a moment of great fear and terror, and Musa confronting the court and power of Firaun in what is set up in Surah Taha as an elaborately constructed, very tension-filled showdown between the two forces. Okay, so what did some of the commentators say about all of this? Here are some examples. I have divided up what the commentators have said about the wahi given to Musa into these different ways. It wasn't really like the wahi given to the male prophets. It was just ilham, a kind of inspiration. Either just ilham or ilqa fil qalb, throwing or casting some idea into her heart. Or ilham or ilqa fil qalb in the form of a kind of hidden type of speech. 2, it was an idea that came in a dream. 3, it was by means of an angel, or by means of an angel but specifically not prophetically, or by means of an angel that was not prophetic, as was similar with the case of Maryam. There's no place in the Quran where Maryam is said directly to have been spoken to in the divine with a direct quote, do this, with the word wahi. But there is, of course, the very famous episode of Jibril the Ruh, El Ruh, appearing to Maryam in the form of a man and announcing that she will be bearing the word, bearing a child, and that child ends up being a word of God. Or an angel, as in the Hadith story of the angel that God sent to speak to three Israelites, one who was blind, one who was leprous, and one who was bald. And there's a story about this angel speaking to them. And then, or as the angel that is said in some hadith to have appeared to a companion of the Prophet by the name of Imran bin Hussein. 4, the divine did not actually speak to her, even though it's quoted in quotes, throw him in direct quote, direct speech, that message was passed on by other male prophets earlier who came to her and said, this is what God wants you to do. Or it was passed on by a male contemporary of hers, such as Shuaib, who many believe was at Midian at the time. Or, as the Quran says in Surah 16, as the wahi that was given to the bees about making their nests in protected places. Or as the wahi that was given to the apostles indirectly through Jesus, not directly from the divine. Or the wahi that was given to the shayateen, the satans. So All of these are ways of saying that this is not at the same level as the wahi that was given to the male prophets. Then there are the three other interpretations that give more emphasis on the way this wahi is actually spoken about in the Quran. As in 99:5, بِأَنَّ رَبَّكَ أَوْحَى as your Lord has revealed to her, which is a reference to, usually viewed as a reference to the earth on the Day of Judgment, in a metaphor of birth, giving forth the message at the end of days that the divine has revealed to her. And then finally, in Ibn Hazm and a few others, she was indeed receiving wahi in the form of nubuwah. And I'll talk a little bit in the end about how Ibn Hazm framed that. Now, Zamakhshari and Fakhruddin Razi, and I think this is something really important about the tafsir literature, the commentaries. People say, well, and let me just give first of all, I think it's a mistake to categorize these commentators by the name of the theological school in which the commentator is said to belong, as if that's all the commentator were about. So Zamakhshari is said to be a Mu'tazilite. Ibn Razi is said to be a rationalist Asharite. Ibn Barajan is said to be a Sufi. But this particular issue is not about Mu'tazilism or Asharism or Sufism. They all come at this issue with a close reading of the text and very careful attention to the language. First, they give a whole series of opinions, the opinions that I've just given, ascribing them, giving them different examples. But then at the end, they say something as if they say, and so we can say, and then they say the following, and I'll just read what Zamakhshari said, and and Razi says something very similar. Bear with me. After citing these interpretations, that must have been passed on to her by a male prophet from before or at the time, et cetera, Zamakhshari goes on to offer an analysis of wahi granted to Musa, in which he insists on the momentous nature of this particular deity to creature communication. That is to say, as if you were summarizing these interpretations just outlined, that Allah Ta'ala communicated to Musa a matter that she could not have gained knowledge of in any other way, that it was a matter of religious well-being, maslaha diniya, and that it was communicated to her in a special manner, without which she could not have arrived at it or gained knowledge of that imperative. As if we had not yet gotten his point, he restates it in more emphatic terms. It had to be given through wahi, yuha la yahallu bihi. He emphasizes the point further by saying that it was the kind of communication that would not have not been revealed. It would not have been communicated in any other way. And it concerned a matter of momentous import, Amr Azim, that merited being communicated through wahi. So here's an example of how it's very difficult to simply pick out a statement from a commentary and say, this is so-and-so's position. As Walid Saleh has shown in his excellent book on commentary, tafsir traditions, it was it was part of the rules of commentary that you gave all the different interpretations that were prior. So it kept growing, but it seems that there's a very strong tension between this series of reports saying that this was like the wahi given to the shaitans and some other things, and then these emphatic, repeated statements about the momentous import of this wahi. Now, Ibn Hazm has a chapter in his famous book on the sects and communities of religions, in which he says that there are he talks about the four greatest saints of, or holy women of Islam. And for him, they are Maryam, Musa, Fatima, and, I feel like Governor Perry. And what was the fourth one? Khadija, yes. So, but when he talks about Musa, he talks about this wahi. And he says, how do people imagine that he compares it to Abraham being told to sacrifice his son. He says, this was something that could not have been communicated through a dream or an idea or a notion or some kind of thought process, that anyone who would sacrifice his son or throw her son into the water, obviously by all normal accounts to perish, would be considered either utterly insane or completely twisted, evil, unless, and the only possible explanation other than that was that this would be a wahi, a genuine wahi, a wahi of the most extraordinary nature, a wahi of absolute security from the source. And then he says, getting irritated the way this famous irritable polymath of Andalus would get, he said, anyone who thinks that this would have come to such figures as a notion or a dream or some other thing should be sent to the hospital at Paymanistan for neurological treatment. And the word is treatment of the dimag, for brain treatment. I don't know whether he's thinking of what kind of treatment he's thinking of, but he also seems to assume that anyone who would think that Musa or Ibrahim would do these things without some totally special communication of wahi must be someone who's a candidate for the same kind of neurological treatment. Now, he takes special exception to the notion of those who say that this wasn't Nubuwah. But among the opinions of those that were recited by Fakhruddin Razi was the opinion attributed to the famous jurist al-Shafi'i, according to which if a woman is not allowed to get married on her own initiative, then certainly she cannot be a prophet in the sense of Nubuwah and go out and proclaim a message like this. My argument does not, I have no stake in the issue about whether she should be called a Nebi or whether she had Nubuwah. That's a complicated argument, and I think a lot depends on how one defines Nubuwah. If one says a Nebi is by nature someone who goes out in public and proclaims a message, then one can say that and Musa never proclaimed this message unless one thinks in the sense of Musa being the message, the word that she casts adrift on the water, who is ultimately brought back to her and becomes the Qurat Ainiha, the soothing of her eye, the joy of her eye. And that process has remarkable similarities to the way that Miriam gave birth miraculously to Isa, who in fact was a word of Allah and a spirit from him, according to the Quran, and was, of course, a Rasul. So these are some thoughts on it. What does it mean for spiritual jihad? I didn't approach this from the term of trying to find jihad in these stories. The word is not used. But it seems to me it relates to a number of profound issues. Speaking truth to power, the leadership role that women and men can play in however different ways that might be, or similar ways. And it also relates to something I was mentioning, that when the Quran says you, have you heard the story of Musa? In most cases, there are some exceptions where it's clearly speaking only to the prophet. But in many cases, it's giving commands that are also addressed to every human being. So the human being can hear you both as the prophet and as direct speech to the human being. Even though, and I'm assuming that women had no problem hearing the masculine you as applying to them, given the fact that in many languages, that's the dominant form anyway. And then the direct speech given to Musa, in the feminine, do not fear, do not sorrow, in facing a situation in which, as one place in the second story in Surah 28 says, her heart became emptied. And if it had not been that we firmed up her heart and her faith, she would have disclosed her child. And of course, once she had disclosed her child, none of that story would have happened. So that statement in the direct address, direct speech, in the feminine, don't fear. I think there's no reason, I found no reason in the discussions that cannot be an example for men and women, just as the statement in the masculine gender to Musa, don't fear, don't sorrow, can be a inspiration for both men and women. So these are some of my thoughts on the issue. I would look very much forward to any discussions that you might have to bring up. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we have questions, please.
Yes, please, in back.
You mentioned that Ibn Hazm places these four women as fairly important. Did you come across in your study anyone who talks about Hagar in a similar way? She also seemed to have received, not Wahi, but visit from Gabriel.
I had the privilege of being a reader for the dissertation of Dr. Holly Horn, who wrote her dissertation on Hagar in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and Islamic tradition. And one of the things she pointed out about the biblical Hagar is that she was spoken directly to by the divine voice twice, and that it's very rare to have that kind of speech for anyone in the early books of the Old Testament. She is not mentioned by name in the Quran, although, of course, her presence is very strongly marked. And, of course, she is remembered most powerfully in the Hajj ritual, when all the those engaged in the Hajj ritual run back and forth 7 times between the 2 hills where she was desperately searching for water for her son, and reenact her experience, I would imagine. And so I think there are some fascinating similarities, although there's no passage in the Quran I know of where there's a divine direct speech to the mother of Ismail. Any other thoughts or remarks? Yes?
Thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. Since Musa is unique in the sense that she has to do with Wahi, and then Maryam is unique because she's the only one that has a proper name as a woman in the Quran. Do you see any, so do you have any thoughts about why other women don't have proper names as a unique characteristic, and Musa in particular?
I think I think the most basic point is that the society that is being represented is a society in which it wasn't really proper to speak about women's names in public. And in fact, some of those customs still survive, where people are not comfortable talking about, you go up and say, how's so-and-so? And you say the name of the wife, or you say, how's your wife? In some cultures, it's still a little bit intrusive. So I think there's a certain amount of adab that, and then the question would be, and the Quran is clearly both, it's reflecting a time and place of the prophet, it's reflecting a time and place of the earlier prophets. And so I think your question then leads to other interpretations about what does that mean going forward in religion and society. Let me just say that the Maryam story is much told in much more detail in the Quran, and there's an extraordinary book recently published in English. The Arabic was published a number of years ago by Hussein Aboud, called Mary in the Quran in the English, a literary study, in which she goes through in intricate detail reflecting both a long tradition of Egyptian study of the Quranic text, going back several generations, and also a lot of contemporary legal theory focusing on the text itself and making a very strong case for the importance of Maryam within the Quran, and making her own case that Maryam should be considered in the category of Nubuwah as well. And I highly recommend that work. It's superbly written, and it's a deeply insightful study. And I think for people that are familiar with the Arabic Quran and those who aren't, she brings that whole complicated story in the Quran really in a way that is both astute and approachable for readers interested. Her name is Hosn Aboud, A-B-B-O-U-D, and the first name is H-O-S-N. And I just happened to read a note about her story. She was studying Arabic literature and Quranic rhetoric in Lebanon. And then there was the Lebanese civil war, and she became involved with refugee work and put her career on hold, and then came back many, many years later and finished her Ph.D. At either the University of Toronto, I think, and then published this extraordinary first-rate critical study. And I think that's it's a really important book, and it's a kind of, I think, a strong message about spiritual jihad, about priorities in life, and about how it's not always the first who end up writing with the most depth. Any other thoughts? I had a conversation with a colleague. Is Elliot here?
Elliot.
Oh, here, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yes, already.
I didn't have a jacket on earlier, so.
yeah, right. And you weren't talking about what we had talked about, and so you threw me off. I was looking, and I was thinking, oh, maybe, you know, but go ahead, please. Did you find anything in Ibn al-Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam about this?
I did. There's about a page or so where he talks about the representations of the basket and the water and Moses and how they're all symbols for various spiritual realities and influences.
You know, Ibn al-Arabi, his relationship to the Musa story, I find is extraordinary. There's a new book, a recent book in translation, translated as The Four Birds, the Treatise of Unification in the Four Birds. It's a Risalat al-Ittihad. It's a very complicated treatise with prose and poetry and rhyme prose and different voices coming from different places, very Ibn al-Arabi-esque. And it's clear that the central speaker voice is going through, is on seeking the path to God. And at one point, he's being chastised by a voice that speaks from within him and outside of him, saying, what is this to and this from? Where is God not existing, that you have to go from one place to another to get there? You have not even arrived at the basic sense yet. You have to be cast into the yum. And the whole next section of that Ibn al-Arabi constructed author voice is then cast into the yum in precisely the way that Musa was cast into the yum. And at other times, Ibn al-Arabi seems to put himself more in the role of Musa. One of the prefaces to his Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the translation of longings, states that as he was reciting one of these poems near the Kaaba, a young woman came up and said, "Sir, excuse me, I'm sorry, but what were you saying just now?" And each verse that he said, she ripped to shreds, saying, what are you talking about? How could a sheikh, who someone has got some grand repute, and excuse me, I'm just a humble slave girl from the daughter of the Rum, in Banata Rum, but I think it's really inappropriate what you said. She critiques each of the four verses, and at the end, he said, "May I ask my niece," as a kind of polite way of talking to her, "may I ask my niece what her name is?" and she says, Qurratu ayn, the calming or the soothing of the eye, which is what the wife of Pharaoh says when they gather up Musa. She says, let's keep him. He'll be a gladdening of the eye for me and for you. And it's what is said about Musa, that God returned Musa to her to soothe her eye. And at that time, and then she says, and then it says, and I said, that is Ibn al-Arabi said in response, Li, to me. And that could be seen as a kind of wise guy statement. To me, you're the gladdening of my eye, but it's a direct quote from the Quran, a direct quote from the wife of Pharaoh, and also a reference to Musa. So in that case, the Ibn al-Arabi voice is putting himself in the place of the women in that way. And of course, the introductions to the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq make it point out that he went to study in Mecca hadith traditions with two famous scholars originally from a family from Isfahan, one of whom was named Fakhr Nisa bint Rustam, and she said she didn't have, she was retired from teaching directly, but he could get an ijazah from her brother. And then he said she was not only Fakhr Nisa, she should be called Fakhr Nisa wa Rijal. And so it's the fact that he's so deeply involved in that story throughout his writings, and he's one of the most important, profoundly respected figures in classical Islam, who made a point, not only in this instance, but in others, in talking about how he had learned wisdom and in different ways studied hadith and had as his spiritual masters both the men and women, and tells their story. Yes?
Yeah, the Quran mentioned the wife of the Pharaoh as a believer. Do you think that's at the time of Musa or a different time?
Well, the wife of the Pharaoh is the one who says, let's save him. He will be a Qurrat Ayn for us. And I'm not aware that there's any more long discussion of her in the Quran. But she says, do not kill him, and she says it in the plural. Well, if she's there with Pharaoh, and it's just her husband, why would she say it in the plural? And in fact, if you look at the Surah 20 and Surah 28, there's very little sense of Pharaoh as whether he's an individual, but also there's a sense of he's not distinguished from his followers the way he is in other surahs. So in the whole thing about casting of the staffs, there's no mention of magicians, there's no mention of his counselors. It has him, he's running around, he's shouting orders, but it never says who he's shouting orders to. It's kind of like he's an individual, but kind of like a swarm. I know that the name given to Pharaoh's wife is Asiya, and it's a popular name among Muslims because she has been venerated as I think for her role in saving Musa, and the fact that she took no role in the oppressive aspects that are narrated of Pharaoh.
There's another one here.
Yes?
Thank you for this talk. There seems to be an appeal to that part of the story in the popular culture. So two examples that I can think of is Superman, the planet is exploding and the child, baby, is being sent to another planet by his parents. And the other example, I watched that movie thanks to my daughter, Kung Fu Panda 2. There again, the panda was being saved by his mother by living with a server. So why is there such an appeal in the popular culture still?
Well, it's, that's I don't know that I have any profound answer to your question. Of course, one finds it in the story of the founders of Rome, who were raised by a wolf or something. So these stories of the loss of a child, it's clearly a very deep, widely shared paradigm, and I think students that study those kind of paradigms cross-culturally and in all kinds of levels of literature, those people would have much more to say on this than I would. I just wanted to mention something I thought of right before the talk, that Ibn Barajan says that the most close parallel to the wahi given to Musa is the wahi in the early part of Surat Yusuf that talks about the wahi of the most beautiful of stories. And in that early part of Surat Yusuf, it's Yaqub, the father of Yusuf, who loses his son, whose son is thrown in a well, and who says Sabrun Jamil. And then through all of this extraordinary realm, that's the way things sometimes work out in a different kind of literature, in some kind of Shakespearean comedy, meaning a happy ending. He's brought back, and his cloak is, he touches his cloak, and there's something very strong about his eyes there, and it really struck me that Yaqub, I don't know that there's any quotations in the Quran about any public proclamations of Yaqub. Certainly Yaqub is considered one of the prophets, one of the Nebis. And it struck me that his role in that story is very similar to Musa's, losing his child, and through this extraordinary narrative of human circumstance and divine predetermination, having the child returned to him in a way that might have seemed remarkable. Yes? Yes?
This is Alan Douglas.
Oh, yes. A famous person in Georgia who used to have these peacocks in trees around his house. And I was really hoping I would see you here. Yes, excuse me for the digression.
What occurred to me as the gentleman was asking this question, you were responding, is that we can see at least the mother of Musa can resonate with us in the kind of ontology that leads from unity into separation, representing the aspect of our consciousness just at the beginning of separation, in the sense that as we move from unity into separation, there's a proximity within our consciousness that's close to unity, of the mother of Musa to Musa. But then there's even, then when she lets Musa go, then this moves further into separation, just like we, at the beginning, you could say, as time begins, as we move into time from eternity, there's a movement into separation, and then when we let go when we who are the mother of Musa lets go of Musa, then that we go further into separation. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that she and Musa can represent aspects of our own consciousness as we move from unity into separation. And then that then sets the stage for the reunion that can be possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I just added one note, perhaps somewhat related to that, that in discussing the Annunciation scene to Maryam in the Quran, Ibn al-Arabi had said that at that moment when the Spirit appeared to her as a man, of course she was in a state of fear for all the obvious reasons. And then when the Ruh said, "Don't fear," Ibn al-Arabi said that it transformed her persona. And then he has this statement, which is the kind of statement that used to make my teacher, Fazlur Rahman, laugh until both his glasses and his outer glasses, because he never wore bifocals, would cloud up and he would have to, he was still a great admirer and reader of Ibn al-Arabi, but Ibn al-Arabi said, had Jesus been conceived at the moment she was in a very fearful state, he would have come out as so surly that no one could bear him. But because he was conceived at the moment where it said, "Don't fear," but at the same time it was this total fear, a total loss, and then a total prayer, the total presence in that prayer that allowed for this spiritual happening and the total reliance on the divine at that moment. So I think that doesn't necessarily translate your very thoughtful and comments, but I think it might have some relationship to the points you were making.
Maybe the connection is I was looking in this handy-dandy Quran that I have on my phone, and following the passage of where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Don't fear, don't be sad." Subsequently, it's, and we rabbatna, we like strengthened her
Right.
heart.
Right.
So that strengthening of the heart, after there, it says the first part was there, and there arose in her heart, in her fu'ad, a fariq, this kind of emptiness.
Right.
And then we strengthened her heart. So the fariq, this firaq, this separation sets this, just like originally when she had to let go of Musa, the separation sets the stage for the movement of Allah, this rabat, this strengthening of her heart. So this, somehow that relates to what you just said, I think.
Let me just add my comment to that struck me. If one could think of that as the mother having to let go of her child in a thinking that the child is lost or perishing. I think any of us who have been parents know what a terrible thought it is to think that one's child might be in danger. It also strikes me that I've been in touch with some people men and women who were grieving the death of their own parents. And so on one level, it's clearly situated in a time of life in a specific relationship. On the other level, the very notion of mortality, the greatest loss may not be one's own, the greatest sense of anguish. The word was faza. Her heart was emptied in this kind of horrified anguish. The greatest anguish of the human condition might not be one's own mortality, but the mortality of one's loved ones, and that could work in either direction. I was just thinking of that in terms of the need for complete grief and the need for a period of grieving after the death of a loved one. And I was having someone say that, she felt like she'd betrayed her father, and I said, just because she wasn't able to stay with him always. And I said, well, you could stay by his grave always, and it would still be the same sorrow. And it seemed to me that I think that story is profoundly moving. And if I could just end, I just wrote a kind of prose effort to translate the second story, which I never really got to talk about, but I thought I could just end with that. I was writing this actually in the car because the translations that I was using had things that I felt I just feel more comfortable in trying to express things in certain ways. Not that I've had a chance to really polish this. And we revealed to Musa to nurse him. And when you fear for him, then cast him into the deep. Do not fear and do not sorrow. We will return him to you and make him a messenger. We'll make him one of al-Mursaleen. Pharaoh's folk caught him up, that he might be an enemy to them and a sorrow. Pharaoh, Haman, and their hosts are sinners. And the wife of Pharaoh said, Qurratu aynin, cooling of the eye. For me and for you, do not kill him. He may be a benefit for us, or we may take him as a child without their realizing it. La wahum la yash'urun. And Musa's heart was emptied in her distress. Nearly would she have disclosed him had we not firmed her heart in faith. Follow him, she told her sister. So she observed him in stealth, they remaining unaware. Wahum la yash'urun. Let me just mention that in both these stories, there's a dialectic of secrecy and apparentness. And God says he keeps things secret, but sometimes he reveals them. The Pharaoh and his, whoever he's talking to, are convening kind of off stage and plotting. And when Musa comes to make his cast, the divine comes into the story and tells him, like in secret, he's there working with Musa in his corner, don't fear. And so here, Pharaoh's wife is saying, we can keep him as a child, and they, presumably Musa's family will, and maybe our people, will have no idea. But it's the same term that was used above. Nearly would she have disclosed him had we not firmed her heart and faith. Follow him, she told her sister, and she observed him in stealth, they remaining unaware, and we had prevented him from nursing. Would you wish me to lead you to a household that will nourish him and be wise guardians for him? So we returned him to his mother that her eye might be soothed, that she not sorrow, and that she know that the promise of God is true, while most of them remain unaware or do not know. And the way that each group is trying to carry out something which the other group does not realize, the way that the parallels are working in the story, in both the stories, I think really highlights this particular section of the early Musa section of the Quran. And I noticed that I have never found a book called Quranic Musa, at least in any Western language. And I think there's good reason for that, because the story of Musa in the Quran is everywhere. It's told in 44 different places. It's told in very many ways. So to separate out the story of Musa in all its complexities in the Quran means one is dealing with a great amount of the Quran. But let's say one more thing about this notion of cast him into the ark. The word ilqa that's used for casting in some of these versions of cast him into the ark, also ikthaf, throw him, is used throughout the Musa story. And what is extraordinary, of course, the Musa story in the Quran has to do with words and the act of casting. Whose word is right? Whose word is authoritative? Musa's telling Pharaoh that his Lord's word is authoritative. Pharaoh calling out and giving commands, and so the battle of words, and then the battle of in the Taha, it's always what is that in your right hand. The battle of what Musa has in his right hand, which transforms itself into a living serpent and back to its former condition, etc. So, and what is cast? In the story, it's not only Musa's staff that's cast, it's Musa himself who's cast. In fact, it's Musa's casting of Musa that is the first casting in the story chronologically. Then Musa is casting, the Pharaoh's group is casting. When Musa casts him into the waters are said to cast him onto the shore. And the commentators say this is really quite metaphorical language. It's like the waters are personified. And then in the second story, it says the family of Musa caught him. It's using the same form, iltaqa. Instead of got him, it's as if they caught him. She cast him, the shores cast him, then they cast it to Musa, to Pharaoh's people. Later on, Musa not only casts, he also strikes with his staff. It's the same kind of motion, but in one case you let go, in one case you don't. He strikes open the sea, which then comes down upon Pharaoh's group. and later on he strikes the rock that breaks into 12 springs. So this whole notion of casting, throwing, Samari casts something from the footstep of the messenger upon the golden calf, and it makes a sound. This whole notion of casting is, I think, related. One can say one casts words, and so if one looks at this, I consider these two, Surah Taha especially, is a surah where the notion of casting is fundamental. And it's really dramatized when, at the very climax of the whole story, Pharaoh's group and Musa and Harun come together, and they each cast, and the divine voice says to Musa, cast! And then it never says what happened, it just says, and the magicians were cast down prostrate. So it's as if the action of cast in this particular telling of the story was deferred onto the magicians, who are cast down in a position of sujood and declare their belief in the God of Harun and Musa. This kind of extraordinary notion that Musa was cast into the waters by his mother and then claimed the authority, or the divine authority was claimed through him, through this series of castings reverberating down. So some thoughts. Thank you very much for sharing this with me.
One more thing I like to say, like one little addition, because I see some students, many people may not know the background of the story. Michael very well explained, very academically and very scholarly, why Moses' mother would cast her son to the Yemen, to the sea. Basically, the Quran speaks of the story that Pharaoh consulted with his magicians. His magicians told him that, of course, this is in the commentaries of the Quran, that a child from Israelites will grow and will destroy your kingdom. So this is Pharaoh. He said, kill all of them then. So all children of Israel were killed, but female of Israelites were left. يُذَبِّحُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيُونَ نِسَاءَهُم. They were leaving their females, and they were killing their males. So the mother of Moses was afraid that Moses also will be killed. And that's why she received the revelation, wahi, and she kissed him in the river. So that is the reason. I mean, some of you may not know the background. So why she was doing this, basically that is the reason that she was doing it.
Thank you.
Well, it was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You clearly have a wonderful group here. They were all very, I felt we were all together. So.